The old man's name was Frank Mitchell, though nobody in that gym bothered to ask. They saw the white hair, the weathered face, the jacket that had seen better days, and they made their assumptions. What they didn't see was the lifetime of discipline etched into every quiet movement, the decades of training that had become as natural as breathing. Frank had come to the gym that morning, looking for his grandson, a college student who'd mentioned training there. He'd simply walked in, stood near the door, waiting patiently while the class finished up. He wasn't there to prove anything. He never was. That's how Frank had lived the last 40 years since leaving the service, keeping his head down, staying quiet, letting his past remain exactly where it belonged, in the past. But the young coach, a man named Derek who'd won a few regional amateur tournaments and let it inflate his ego beyond reason, he saw an opportunity for entertainment. An old man in a fighting gym was comedy gold for social media. Derek had built his reputation on being bold, brash, loud. His students loved it, fed off his confidence. He taught them that intimidation was half the battle, that projecting dominance mattered as much as technique. So when he saw Frank standing there, silent and unassuming, he couldn't resist. Derek strutted over, his students following like a pack sensing blood. He looked Frank up and down with exaggerated disbelief, then turned to his class with a theatrical shake of his head. He asked Frank if he was lost, if he needed directions to the bingo hall down the street. The students laughed on cue. Frank just met Derek's eyes with that same sad, serious expression and said quietly that he was waiting for someone. Derek wasn't satisfied with that. He circled Frank slowly, making a show of it, asking if Frank had ever even been in a fight, suggesting maybe he'd stumbled in thinking this was a senior center. The disrespect hung thick in the air. One of the students, a young woman with more awareness than the others, looked uncomfortable, but she didn't speak up. Nobody did. They were all caught in Derek's gravity, his performance. Derek then announced his challenge. $500 if the old man could last 10 seconds, just 10 seconds, in the ring with him. He pulled the cash from his wallet, waved it around. He said he'd go easy, wouldn't even use his legs, just hands. He said it would be the easiest money Frank ever made, assuming he didn't break a hip trying. More laughter. Frank looked at the money, then at Derek, then toward the door. He could have left, should have left. But something in Derek's eyes, that absolute certainty that he could humiliate another human being without consequence, that triggered something Frank had kept buried for a very long time. Frank spoke quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, and said he didn't want the money. Derek laughed, said of course he didn't, because he knew he'd lose. But Frank wasn't finished. He said if Derek wanted to spar, they could spar, but not for money, not for a show. Derek's grin widened. He said the old man was scared, trying to back out. Frank shook his head slowly and said he'd spar on one condition. If Frank won, Derek would donate that $500 to the local veteran shelter and apologize to his students for using them as an audience for cruelty. Derek's face flickered with something, maybe annoyance at being lectured, but he was too committed now, too deep into his performance. He agreed immediately, laughing, saying it wouldn't matter because there was no way this was happening. He told his students to clear the mat to get their cameras ready. This was going to be legendary content. Frank removed his red jacket carefully, folded it, set it on a bench. Underneath he wore a plain grey t-shirt that hung loose on his frame. He looked even older without the jacket, more fragile. Derek's students were already captioning their videos in their heads. The gym's other members, serious fighters who'd been working the heavy bags, stopped to watch. Some looked concerned. One older man in the back, a former boxer, narrowed his eyes at Frank, studying him in a way the younger crowd wasn't. They stepped onto the mat. Derek was still talking, still playing to his audience, explaining how he'd make this quick and painless, how he respected his elders too much to actually hurt the old man. Frank said nothing. He simply stood in a loose stance, hands at his sides, weight balanced in a way that the former boxer in the back immediately recognized. Derek bounced on his toes, showing off his footwork, his conditioning. He threw a few shadow punches fast and sharp, making sure everyone saw his speed. Then he looked at one of his students and told her to time it, 10 seconds starting when he made first contact. He turned back to Frank with a predatory smile and asked if the old man was ready. Frank nodded once, his expression unchanged, sad and serious. Derek moved in, casual, confident, throwing a lazy jab toward Frank's shoulder, not even aiming to hurt, just to start the clock and the humiliation. What happened next took 4 seconds. Frank's movement was so subtle, so economical, that half the room missed it. He slipped Derek's jab with a minimal shift of his head, stepped inside Derek's guard with footwork that seemed to defy physics for a man his age, and executed a perfectly timed sweep combined with a palm strike to Derek's center mass. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't brutal, it was simply inevitable. Derek's feet left the mat, his body rotated in the air, and he landed flat on his back with a sound that echoed through the suddenly silent gym. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs. He lay there gasping, staring at the ceiling, unable to process what had just happened. The gym was frozen. Phones were still recording, but hands had gone slack. Nobody was laughing now. The student who'd been timing it looked at her phone and said in a small voice that it had been 4 seconds. 4 seconds from first contact to Derek, flat on the mat. Frank stood over him, not gloating, not celebrating, just looking down, with that same sad expression, and he extended his hand to help Derek up. Derek stared at the hand like it was a foreign object. His face had gone from cocky tan to pale white. He took the hand, let Frank pull him to his feet, and for the first time seemed to actually see the man standing before him. Frank spoke quietly, his voice carrying in the silence. He said that strength isn't about youth or size or how loud you talk. He said real warriors don't need to prove anything. They just need to be ready when it matters. Derek opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He managed to ask who Frank was, what he was. Frank shook his head and said it didn't matter who he was. What mattered was that Derek had students who looked up to him, who trusted him to teach them not just how to fight, but how to be. He said Derek had a responsibility to do better. The words landed harder than the takedown had. Derek's face was a mixture of shame and confusion, and something else, maybe the first crack in the armor he built around himself. That's when the older man from the back of the gym stepped forward. He walked slowly onto the mat, his eyes locked on Frank, and there was recognition there, deep and certain. He stopped a few feet away, and his voice came out rough with emotion. He said a name, a full name, Colonel Frank Mitchell, and he asked if it was really him. The gym's attention snapped to the older man, then back to Frank. Frank's shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of his past settling back onto him. He nodded. The older man's eyes filled with tears. He said he'd served under Frank in the Marines, said Frank had been his commanding officer during 2 tours, said Frank was a legend in certain circles, a master of close-quarters combat who trained entire units in hand-to-hand techniques that had saved countless lives. He said Frank had more commendations than most people had, birthdays that he'd turned down promotions to stay with his men in the field. The man's voice broke as he said Frank had pulled him personally from a burning vehicle in Fallujah, had carried him half a mile under fire to an evac point. He said he owed Frank his life. The revelation hit the room like a shockwave. Derek's students looked at their coach, then at Frank, trying to reconcile the quiet old man in the worn t-shirt with the warrior being described. Derek himself had gone completely still, his face now drained of all color, his earlier arrogance replaced by something that looked like horror at what he'd done. Frank raised a hand, gentle but firm, stopping the older man from saying more. He said that was a long time ago, that he was just a man now, trying to live quietly. But the older man, tears streaming down his face now, shook his head. He said some things don't stop mattering just because time passes. He said respect is earned and kept. And Frank had earned more than most people could imagine. He turned to Derek and his voice hardened. He said Derek had no idea how lucky he was, that Frank had shown restraint, that the techniques Frank knew could have ended things very differently. He said Derek should be ashamed, not just for the disrespect but for doing it in front of students, for teaching them that mockery was acceptable. Derek's legs seemed to give out slightly. He sat down hard on the mat. His hands were shaking. He looked up at Frank and tried to speak, but his voice cracked. He tried again, and managed to say he was sorry, that he had no idea, that he'd been stupid and cruel. Frank looked at him for a long moment, then said that not knowing isn't an excuse, that every person deserves basic respect, regardless of who they are or what they've done. He said Derek needed to learn that before he taught another class. Derek nodded, unable to meet Frank's eyes. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and with shaking hands counted out $500. He said he'd take it to the veterans' shelter himself, today, and he'd apologize to everyone there too. Frank's grandson arrived then, walking through the gym door, oblivious to what had just transpired. He saw Frank and waved, smiling, asking if he was ready to grab lunch. Frank picked up his red jacket, put it back on slowly, and nodded. He started to walk toward the door, then paused and turned back to Derek. He said, "One more thing." He said that being a teacher is a sacred responsibility, that students don't just learn techniques, they learn how to be human beings. He said Derek had a choice now to keep being who he'd been or to become someone better. Pawson. He said he hoped Derek would choose wisely. Then Frank walked out with his grandson, leaving behind a gym full of people who would never forget what they'd witnessed. Derek sat on the mat for a long time after Frank left. His students didn't know what to say, didn't know how to process seeing their invincible coach humbled so completely. But something had shifted. One by one, they deleted the videos from their phones. The young woman who looked uncomfortable earlier sat down next to Derek and quietly said that maybe this was a good thing, that maybe they all needed to learn this lesson. Derek nodded slowly, wiping his eyes. He stood up eventually and gathered his students. He told them class was cancelled for the day. He said he needed to do some thinking about the kind of teacher he wanted to be, the kind of person he wanted to be. He made good on his promise that afternoon, driving to the veterans' shelter with the $500 and a genuine apology that came from a place of newfound humility. The story spread through the local martial arts community quickly, but not in the way Derek had originally intended. It became a story about respect, about hidden depths, about the danger of judging people by their appearance or age. Frank never spoke about it publicly. He went back to his quiet life, visiting his grandson, volunteering at the same veterans' shelter Derek had donated to, living with the same humble dignity he always had. But Derek changed. His teaching style transformed. He started emphasizing respect and discipline as much as technique. He brought in older martial artists as guest instructors, listened to their wisdom, learned from their experience. His students noticed the difference and responded to it, becoming not just better fighters, but better people. Some of them tracked down Frank months later to thank him, to tell him how that one moment had changed their entire gym's culture. Frank always responded the same way, with that sad, serious expression, saying he was glad something good came from it, but that they should thank Derek for being willing to learn and change. The older Marine who'd recognized Frank stayed in touch, and through him, other veterans started coming to the gym, finding a place where their experience was valued, where age was respected rather than mocked. The gym became known as a place where warriors of all ages trained together, learned from each other, and understood that true strength has nothing to do with ego and everything to do with discipline, respect, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing who you are and what you're capable of, without needing to prove it to anyone. Years later, Derek would tell new students about the day an old man in a red jacket taught him the most important lesson of his life in just 4 seconds. He'd tell them about the $500 bet that cost him his arrogance, but gave him back his integrity. He'd tell them that real warriors don't need to announce themselves, don't need to dominate or humiliate. They just need to be ready when it matters and respectful always. And somewhere across town, Frank Mitchell would be sitting in his small apartment, or walking through the park, or helping serve meals at the veterans shelter, still wearing that same red jacket, still carrying that same sad, serious expression, still living proof that the most dangerous people are often the quietest ones. And that respect should never be determined by appearance, age, or circumstance, but should be given freely to all until they prove unworthy of it, and even then with a chance for redemption, because that's what warriors do. They protect, they teach, they lift others up, and they never ever forget that strength without honor is just violence, and skill without respect is just cruelty, and the measure of a person isn't found in how they treat those who can challenge them, but in how they treat those they believe cannot.